All right, well, I'd like to thank the organizers for setting up this panel. I think it's really important to have agribusiness in this conversation. As Matt said, it's really critical to the future of conservation to have everyone at the table. So I'm really excited by our panelists here. We've got Sime from Sime Darby, which is a major Malaysian palm oil producer. We've got Lucita Jasmin, who's with Apple, which is a major pulp and paper company that primarily operates in Indonesia. We have Rudi, who was the 2014 winner of the Golden Environmental Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for environmental activism, for his work in producing the Leuser ecosystem in Sumatra. And then we have Janice, who's a researcher focused on the ecological impacts of land use change. So I'm going to start by providing a little context. So as I mentioned, plantation development is one of the biggest drivers of land use change, especially forest loss and peatlands conversion in Southeast Asia. So in Asia, we're primarily talking about pulp and paper, timber, oil palm, and rubber. In the Amazon, it's more about conversion for cattle pasture, and soy. And Africa's a different story. It's less about industrial drivers of deforestation, but essentially it's mostly oil palm and rubber if you're looking at agribusiness there. So because this has been such a big driver of deforestation for a long time, it's been a major focus for activist groups and conservationists. But things are changing. So there's been a lot of campaigns and things like that. So in recent years, a number of major corporations have launched these so-called zero deforestation commitments. And so generally, zero deforestation means there are several components. There's social and environmental safeguards, so things like free, prior informed consent and interacting with communities, a commitment to not convert peatlands, and then also a commitment not to convert high conservation value areas, so that's HCV. That's an important acronym, will probably come up a lot. And then also HCS, which is high carbon stock areas, so that would be peatlands. There's still a lot of debate over what that actually means. So some companies have a certain position on what HCV means or HCS means. So that's an ongoing debate that may come out in this conversation. So companies are now moving from the commitment phase to the implementation phase, which is a lot more difficult. Governments haven't necessarily been supportive of these commitments. So the Malaysian government has classified oil palm plantations as a state secret. So you can actually have a lot of trouble if you publish these maps. So the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oils, runs this issue quite a bit. And then the Indonesian government has classified the Indonesian Palm Oil Pledge, which is a group of large palm oil producers and traders, as a cartel. And as of today, IPOP, which that is known as, will probably be disbanded. So there's a lot of concerns about that. So with that background, I'd like to start the discussion here. So we're going to open with Sime. So Sime Darby is one of the companies that has established a zero deforestation commitment. Your prior company, which was New Britain Palm Oil, was one of the first to establish one of these zero deforestation agreements several years ago. So I wanted to see if you could take us through that process of developing that policy, why you decided to do that, what it means to your business, and how you're implementing the policy operationally.
I think can everybody hear me okay? Is it good? Yeah, it is coming through. Even the cheap seats? I think the first thing I have to say is that when you start developing a policy like that, it's a hard slog. I mean, the first thing is the outside never trusts you. I mean, we are big business, and when you look at the trust indices, big business is right down there with governments. Whereas NGOs, be they social or environmental, are right up at the top in people's consciousness of levels of trust. So I think the first thing is there's external distrust when you start on this process. But there's also something that Eric didn't touch on in yesterday's opening speech, which is the internal dissension. Not everybody in a company believes in sustainability. Most of the people in the plantation industry are what would be referred to as Generation Jones. Really a grabbing me type of attitude. They're not Generation Y and they're not Generation X. They've not yet come through to those senior positions. So very conservative with a big C. go to the details of it now. I think New Britain Palm Oil operated in Papua New Guinea over 40 odd years, so it started in the 1960s. It already had a number of very high standards of environmental protection, simply because a lot of it was ex-British planters who had gone over there, and the terrain and the difficulties were very difficult to operate. For example, we never burned to clear land. I'd like to say my forefathers were very, very environmentally conscious. The answer is they weren't. The rainfall at over 4 meters meant that the ground conditions were just too wet to burn. But we've maintained that standard, and when we moved into the Solomon Islands and into the drier parts of Papua New Guinea, we've still maintained that no-burn policy. So that has really been nearly 5 decades of no burning. Sime Darby, the company that's taken us over, and I've only been with Sime Darby now for 16 months, has had a no-burn policy for 3 decades. And that's been the basis, I think, of a lot of our no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation. People now refer to it as a 4-letter acronym. NDPE. No deforestation, no peat, no exploitation. And those big 3 have, I think, steered the way that we have thought in terms of our policies. So our policies cover E, S and G, the environmental, the social and the governance. Governance is very important when you're looking at a policy by a big company. The way it's structured, the way that sustainability has a voice, and where exactly that voice is heard is very, very important in the context of a company. So when you're engaging with them, and I'm talking about engagement later on in this conference, it's important to look how the structure is. That's why we always talk about ESG, and when you talk about reporting on the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, your sustainability reports that come out, they always talk about ESG as well. I think, Rhett, without going on too long, is that really the policy is very hard. It goes against the grain. You've had to convince people, and it's never right. It never satisfies my internal stakeholders, I'm going too far, and it never satisfies my external stakeholders, we're not going far enough. But there is a limit to how fast the company can travel. One thing I've learned, New Britain Palm Oil, I've been doing this for 30 years. 20 years with New Britain Palm Oil, it was a very nimble company, and we could move very quickly. Sime Darby is enormous. New Britain Palm Oil fits into Sime Darby as 4.5% of Sime Darby's business. It's actually just 10% of its plantations. And to turn an organisation as big as that, to get those wheels going, I mean, sometimes I do describe it, I get shocked for this, but I do describe it like trying to nail jelly to a wall. It's not easy at all. But once you get a juggernaut beginning to move, then it is a real game changer in the whole arena. You're right about the Official Secrets Act. I've been threatened with the Official Secrets Act in Malaysia. I have been threatened also in Indonesia, because we have operations in Indonesia, in order when we talk about transparency. We have a very transparent system. We're skating very, very close to the limits of the law. We will not break the law. A company our size can't afford to do that. And when you hinted about the fact of IPOP, and in this seat there should really be a lady called Dr. Petra Mikas, who would have been able to tell you more in detail about IPOP. An organisation of forward-thinking companies. Sime Darby was not a member. It doesn't have that big operations in Indonesia. But the Indonesians got together and they really tried to put onto this world an overarching policy of pre-competitive collaboration, which was a game changer. And as Rhett hinted, it's been shut down, it's been closed off, and it's been seen as a cartel, as an antitrust, price fixing. All those kind of things will start to come out in the media, not in yours, I hope, which aren't true. It was never set up as a cartel, it wasn't about price fixing. It was about pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, so part of the goal of IPOP was to encourage the government to then adopt policies that would be supportive of conservation.
Yeah, please lobby the government to be supportive.
So Lucita, Simon mentioned governance. A lot of the places where you operate essentially don't have much governance. There's not much government around, and when it is around, it may not do very much. So what is the private sector role in governance, what is the private sector role in conservation in places where there is very little governance?
Thank you, Rhett. Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. It's Filipino for a beautiful morning to all of you. So, I think, again, referring to the keynote address of Dr. Mayor delivered yesterday, he concluded with the remarks. Okay, is this close enough? All right, sure. It's a little tricky at the angle of the mic. So I think his conclusion yesterday set the tone for this conversation quite appropriately when he said there are opportunities for conservation with business, and one such opportunities would be basically in how private sector can support conservation initiatives. Now, there are several ways that we are doing that, and I'm going to cite a few examples. The first is, as you mentioned, in the aspect of governance. Private sector can actually play a role in putting in place a system for active management of protection of conservation areas. In a developing economy context like Indonesia, one would expect that there would be several types of risks that conservation areas are actually subjected to, whether this be the risk of encroachment, the risk of illegal logging, or illegal conversion, mainly through burning. So based on our experience, more than 2 decades of experience in Sumatra, yes, it does help a lot for a conservation area to thrive or even to survive, for it to have or to be part of a system of management and protection. Now, the second role that the private sector can play, of course, is in identifying and addressing the root causes or the socioeconomic pressures that are actually causing the risks to forest resources. And one of the ways that we do that is by actually developing economic alternatives for the communities, enabling the communities with skills, providing them support, creating employment, so that eventually, I guess, or ultimately, the objective is to alleviate the pressure on forest resources coming from socioeconomic reasons. But these two examples are rather fundamental with the operations that we do. Now, where it gets a little bit more interesting, particularly with this community, I suppose, is that the private sector can actually support with its resources. It has the resources, it has the motivation, the incentive to actually work with the scientific community on research regarding conservation. How could we better do this? Now, in our company alone, we have 38 PhDs, and I guess there are 160 science-related or scientific jobs. We've been working in partnership, for example, with conservation institutions like the Fauna and Flora International or the Nature Conservancy. We have recently just established what we call an independent peat expert working group, which is basically a collection of peat scientists from all over the world. And we are actually seeking their advice, opening up the operations of the company to them for their review, so that they can come back with us with recommendations on how to move forward with this. Basically what is happening is that part of the strategy now is to strengthen the interface between science and policy, science and practice, even within the private sector. Now, why is this happening? Why are we turning to science much more increasingly these days? Because I think our approach to conservation is also evolving. We all started, for example, which is perhaps dealing with complying with the regulation, for example, like when we started in the early 90s, the Indonesian government was simply requiring 10%, setting aside 10% of your concession for conservation. But then, and we were all just looking at individual concessions. Now from there we moved on, for example, in pioneering a commitment called the High Conservation Value Commitment. Now this is a voluntary commitment that's adopted by companies. And then eventually, of course, the approach has evolved to now even include the high carbon stock, as was mentioned earlier. Now we're all learning to advance towards the landscape approach. Just a week ago, we had a meeting with our stakeholder advisory committee that involves some of our critical stakeholders, Greenpeace and WWF, and we were actually looking at a whole map of all our concessions where we have identified or delineated for them where the conservation areas are. Because now we're having to re-rationalize how the conservation areas have been mapped out, and to just try to see if there's a way where we can in fact optimize the conservation value instead of just looking at isolated patches of conservation in different concession areas. Are the connectivities working? Are the wildlife corridors working? Are we better off actually, putting them together in one location or closer to a particular park? So this type of re-rationalization is happening. Now, as a final point, I guess, what is the driver for all this? I think we are starting to see a business case for conservation. Yesterday's presentation by Dr. Mayer also said something like, is there an aspect of greenwashing to this? Now, if you ask us where it's not greenwash, it's where it actually makes business sense. Because when it is part of a business strategy, it is institutionalized and it is actually delivered on. Why is it making business sense for us? Because we're now seeing that the plantations don't exist in isolation. They're actually part, or they're actually part of a bigger landscape. What happens in a conservation area eventually feeds into the health of the plantations. We're looking at the overall ecosystem services. We're now starting to see the value of the natural capital. We're now starting to see the value of the ecosystem services and increasingly incorporating this into the long-term valuation of the business. So I guess beyond governance and looking at a broader view to sustainability and conservation being a critical component of that, private sector is increasingly playing a role in this area.
Thanks. So Rudi, we've heard about these commitments from the private sector, but can they actually be trusted to implement these policies? And what is the role of civil society and activist groups in shifting these industries towards less damaging practices?
Thank you. About the zero deforestation, that is the interesting point in our rules to protect the Indonesian forest. But I believe this will be implemented in the future. But when? The question is when. Maybe after all of Indonesian forests will die. Because right now, deforestation still happens in Indonesia, and there is no control from the government to stop this. And maybe in the future, maybe some of the companies will follow the rules to our commitment to zero deforestation. But Indonesia also have the thousands of the plantation, the companies that there is no, we don't follow the system for the good system for the environmental. They're still burning, they're still clearing the forest. And right now, almost all Indonesian forests, there is extinct outside of the national park or protected forest. And also based on our experience, in many places, like a production forest, where the logging concession can operating in that location, that the government also can release this forest to be plantation, timber plantation. So this is worse in the future, and I don't believe that zero deforestation will be happening in the future. And our problem also about the smallholder plantation, that is small scale, but because in the one location, thousands of people encroach the forest, that is make our forest is extinct. And that's why in our principle, we're not against the palm oil. We're only against the palm oil or rubber our cocoa when we destroy the forest, because the impact for the deforestation is directly to our communities. And like no, this is one example. In our province, in Aceh province, the government allocate around 50 million US dollar per year to help to dealing with the mitigation natural disaster, especially with flooding. And this is the impact from deforestation. This is not only by the palm oil, but also the rubber and other activities inside the forest. And make our communities is poor. In Aceh, more than 15% of the communities still live under of the government's for level. So, but in Aceh, around 1.2 million hectares palm oil in that location. That is 20% of Aceh province the area. And one district in Aceh, this is my district, in Aceh Tamiang. In the total, the area only around 200,000 hectares, but palm oil almost 100,000 hectares. This 50% of our district is occupied by the palm oil. But 15% of our communities is still poor. So the district said this, the palm oil is not give the positive impact for the economy, for the local economy. And yeah, that's happened right now in our region and also province in, I think in general, Indonesia. This is very clear. Our role is about against the deforestation, and yeah, I hope in the future the key point is government, not the plantation or the companies again. Because if government is very clear to say this, there is no more for the palm oil or the deforestation. This is really good for the forest of Indonesia. And yeah, right now the government of Jokowi and also the provincial government in Aceh declared for the moratorium for the mining and the palm oil for the new permit. But the problem is the old permit, the former permit, they can still clear it. And this is million of the hectare will convert to the palm oil. And last week, the Aceh government also released the letters to the companies to stop the clearing inside of the Leuser ecosystem. But by me, this is not enough too, because our problem not only palm oil, but also the other activities to change our forest to be forest. I think this is, from me, this is very clear, because if we not against the palm oil, we only against the activities where they destroy the forest. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudi. So Janice, you're the scientist on the panel here. What does the science say about balancing agro-industrial production versus maintenance of ecosystem services, biodiversity, and forests?
Yeah, thank you, Rhett. I think Rudi pointed out a good issue, which is that at the end of the day, it's really about clearing of the habitats and also causing deforestation from all these agro-industrial production. And when we look at new industrial production, I think it's very clear that such development should not occur at the expense of locked or intact forests, because there are many studies that show that all these habitats are very depopulated compared to, in terms of their biodiversity levels, compared to agro-industrial monocultures. So in terms of new production lands, these kinds of developments should stay clear from places which are rich in biodiversity as well as carbon stocks. There are many different studies over the last few decades that have shown the kind of impacts that all these monoculture agro-industrial plantations have on biodiversity, as well as greenhouse gas emissions, fires, water pollution, because of fertilizer use as well as the mill production. So the environmental impacts are pretty clear, but I think the kind of research questions that that researchers are kind of moving from questions looking at the impacts of these production systems towards how can we mitigate or how can we look into managing the production system such that we can try to reduce the impacts on existing plantations. So we already know, or say for example, if we're looking towards opening up new plantations, it's very clear that these habitat systems, which are very rich in biodiversity and carbon, should not be touched, especially peatlands. But if we are looking at really trying to meet production targets and also trying to provide rural economic development, then we should definitely look into lands which are not so rich in carbon and also biodiversity. And there are some, I think, government plans as well as NGO work that are trying to identify these degraded areas and to encourage local community as well as partnerships with companies to develop these lands for production. So in terms of the studies or the questions that I think most of the community or most of the scientists in this field are asking is really moving away from measuring the impacts, although there are still some impacts that are not well understood. For example, the aquatic biodiversity issue, and moving towards how to mitigate or how to enhance the environment such that we can ensure that some of these ecosystem services as well as biodiversity can thrive in the agro-industrial systems. So one example I can think of is the work that came from one of our PhD students in Princeton, and he looked at the buffer zones around these oil palm plantations and how they can be a positive impact on the aquatic biodiversity. I think there was also another study that looked at how some of these oil palm plantations shouldn't be grown close to rivers as well as floodplains because it would be an economic loss to them due to the flooding issues. And it's also bad for water pollution. So, so there is a clear moving away from these questions, or rather an evolution of the questions from just simply measuring the impacts and looking more towards the mitigation side of agro-industrial development.
Thanks, Janice. So Simon and Lucy, your companies have cleared a lot of forest over the years, like both your companies and your suppliers. Why is it different now? Are these impacts that Janice was talking about, are they actually having an impact? Are they affecting your business case now? Things like haze, is that bad for reputation? Are you reacting to that? Or why are your companies changing now?
Well, I've been doing this for 30 years, so I'm not changed. Certainly the companies that I represent and work for are beginning to change. I do keep reminding Sime Darby that there's only a small change in its name before it becomes Simon Darby. It's not going down too well with the board at the moment. I think the change came really with the dawn of the RSPO. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I was one of the original architects of it. A multi-stakeholder group. I believe Darryl will be talking about this. He's the current CEO, used to be called Secretary General. It defines sustainability with a set of 8 principles which covered everything from transparency and legal to best practice to best social practice to what you do with new developments, and that's why I want to come and link back to it. And if I wander off, you'll bring me back, I know. It didn't just define principles. It took those principles into practices. It bundled around the principles some 41 criteria which allowed expression of what the aspiration were of those principles, and then it concreted them by actually setting key performance indicators, auditable indicators that third parties can walk into a plantation and have objective evidence that you are expressing the intention of those principles. Now that's a good standard. There's an even better standard, it's called the Sustainable Agricultural Network, or SAN standard. That didn't, at that time, apply to palm oil and was only to smaller scale farms. This started in around about 2002, the first idea. By 2004, the Round Table was an organisation that was actually living, and by 2008, there was a standard. And now today, some 20% of the industry is under this particular standard. That's higher than FSC, it's higher than Marine Stewardship Council, it's higher than any other sustainable standard in the world. But it's still 20%, which means 80% is exactly what you were saying, outside of that limit. I think the bigger companies, the more forward-looking companies, if you go down that list, are the ones that are following that standard. And indeed, there's now something called RSPO Next. But before there was RSPO Next, there was something else. And I have to be honest, we're not very good at names. It's called POIG, Palm Oil Innovation Group. Yeah, we're really crap at naming things, I have to be honest. But the Palm Oil Innovation Group was Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network, Forest Peoples Programme, WWF, my company, New Britain Palm Oil, a small company in Brazil called Agro-Palma, and an even smaller company in Colombia called Dabon. We came together because during the review of the standard of the RSPO, it didn't go far enough as far as we were concerned. Now that was the forward thinking, the innovative group. And that is even a smaller percentage of that 20%. We still haven't got to the tipping point. And everybody thinks it's the big companies. You talk about Hayes. I mean, yes, Singapore, please bring on prosecutions. Because the prosecutions will allow those maps to be produced in court, which will actually exonerate, I think, many of the larger companies. And you will really begin to see where the fires are. If you're interested, you can watch the fires in real time. And Global Forest Watch on its website, WRI, there is a dashboard. It's using the NASA satellite imagery. My own company does it and puts out reports on it. RSPO uses to monitor it. So you can actually see it in real time. And not in real time, but you can also see the degree of deforestation on their website. So just remember that, Global Forest Watch. Google it and look at their websites. Why are we changing? I think we actually got the spear in the chest moment a lot earlier. I think we started to believe in these things. I always say there's three types of people in sustainability. There's the missionaries, the people that really, really believe in it. There's the mercenaries, the people that only see the business case, and there is a business case. And then there's the misfits, Glenn, people that are actually going to do it anyway, because that's exactly what they feel like. So, some people, the business case, and the business case is just simply follow the money. Look at what the customers are asking, and then wonder why the customers who buy our oil are asking for these kind of things, and the reason is NGOs. The people that run the customer facing, the consumer goods, the fast moving consumer goods, the people that buy the products that we produce and then sell them, are frightened to death that there'll be a campaign against them. Now, it is not generally the public that starts these campaigns. It's the advocacy groups. And that's the role that they play, and it's a very, very important role. So if you want to get things changed with the 80% of the industry that's not following any kind of standard, that is still opening up areas of peat, and we should never have planted on peat. It is still cutting down, not primary forest, although some of them are, but indeed young regenerating forest and not giving it a chance to recover. There are indeed social practices which are far below not just a decent living wage, but the minimum wage. There is bondage. The UK has just passed the Modern Day Slavery Act. Who would have thought in 2015 when it came in that we would ever talk about modern day slavery? I know it's a biodiversity conference, but you also have people in the title as well. All of these things are happening today. There is modern day slavery, there is exploitation, there is still planting on peat, there is still deforestation. It's not happening in the 20%. Yes, I know we've had a few cases of rogue players. You could expect that. It's happening in the 80%. Promote good practices and beat to death those that are doing bad practices. And we always get it wrong. We never ever praise the people that have actually got it right. And then what that's doing is a disincentive. You have a chance here to change people's views, to walk away from this conference and to think about what I've said, and to say, I wonder if there are companies that should be encouraged and identified as different from companies that should be absolutely jumped upon.
Accept.
I think in my view, basically, the company's responses are a factor of how the times have also been evolving, and in terms of what's available to us, in terms of best practices, in terms of standards. When we started with our operations in the early 90s, I think we were also, at least in our part of the industry, the first to even adopt a no-burn policy, and that was in 1994 for us. You know, I mean, because at that time, in most parts of the country, it's almost legal, in fact, to use fire, and it was even a bit, I guess, even seen as a pioneering effort on the part of the company to even adopt that policy. When we adopted the high conservation value commitment, the toolkit for Indonesia wasn't available yet then. So I guess as companies are starting to learn and to open up to new standards, then of course the practices and the policies also change. I guess there's also a recognition that eventually, even when we operate in Indonesia, we are as much a part of the global system. And as we continue to embrace that, then we become, of course, engaged not just with the local stakeholders, but then with the international stakeholders. Market access is also a particular incentive to this, because, of course, as we become much more global in our approach and with the distribution of our products, then we are also having to respond to some of the standards that are also expected of us by the global north, and which to an extent, despite the challenges that we have in actually effectively adopting this in the global south, but these are standards that we're having to deal with and that we are also responding to. You mentioned as well, of course, that there is now an increasing recognition of the business case. I think companies, the business is maturing to an extent that it is already seeing, you know, even at a longer term than it normally would. And with that longer term understanding of really what is going to make this business sustainable over the next 50 down to 100 years, then yes, then also there's a broader approach to what the sustainability of the business is all about, beyond just what the operations actually also require.
Thanks. So we've heard about these commitments and companies, you know, say they're changing. So what would be next? Let's say these zero deforestation policies work and you want to look kind of moving forward. So start talking about things like restoration of ecosystems. So Rudi, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you've done some of this work with the oil palm in Aceh, but also more broadly, you know, how do you start to sort of reverse some of the damage that's been done in these ecosystems over the past 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, in Leuser ecosystem, it's around 100,000 hectares is occupied by the palm oil. Some of them is legal because they got the permit before the Leuser ecosystem established. But around 50% of this palm oil is illegal. That's why we need to restore the forest, and we work with the communities and governments. And yeah, we try to start this with the reforestation with cutting down the palm oil, and the forest is easier to come back. And in our experience, without the intervention, human intervention, only in 5 years the forests come back and the biodiversity also come back, easier to come back. And we find the tiger, elephant, and orangutan in the restoration site. And also our college in North Sumatra also doing the same too. And yes, almost the majority in forest Indonesia is easier to come back by themselves. But yeah, we need more reforestation. And I think in the future that if the zero deforestation is happen, I think the companies, the big companies or the small companies can work with the communities, smallholder, because right now in Aceh or Indonesia, this smallholder only, they have the land, they own the land, but the productivity of the palm oil is very low. In Aceh, only 1 month for 1 hectare, only maximum 2 tons per month for 1 hectare. In the dry season, only 1 ton per month. So I think that in the future, this is good if the companies can work together with the smallholder, not the encroaching forest, but work with them to increase the productivity of the palm oil in their lands, and that's why that we don't need the expansion of the palm oil anymore. And yeah, this is the problem in our region right now is not about the companies, but this is about the communities. It's the biggest threat right now, because after the government declared there is no new permit for the inside of Leuser ecosystem, but the clearing still happen by the communities, by the rich persons, and that's why I think the companies also need to track especially with by the mills, the plantation mill, to track the source of the fruit, of the palm oil. And they have to stop to purchase the palm oil from the forest. And the other thing is how communities can involve and agree for the zero deforestation. That's why they need the government hand to stop this. I think that's from.
Thanks, Rudi. So Janice, large parts of Riau and South Sumatra are essentially ecological disaster zones now. You've had the water tables drained. So if you start a fire, you can't put it out. All this haze is, coming to Singapore on a fairly regular basis. So how do we move beyond that world towards something where you're actually having productive ecosystems? And how are scientists quantifying that and try to figure out what's next, and what sort of are there partnerships being formed with companies to sort of understand what's strategic and what needs to happen?
So with regards to the peatlands, which are pretty much devastated by draining and also plantation development, I think there are some programs which are working with communities to try to encourage communities to ensure that there will not be any burning activities within their own village land for the peatlands which are in their own villages. With regards to restoration of peatlands, I think that's something that is a very challenging aspect of restoration work, because the peatland ecosystem is very sensitive, and this was something that was made aware when I went for a conference in Berlin, and there was a ton of peatland experts. And I myself, living in Singapore and having Indonesia just, close by, never really understood the kind of how fragile and how vulnerable this ecosystem is. How the water table is actually kind of like sustained by the trees that are on these systems. And when you cut down the trees, that's really when the impact begins, because the water tables start to already decrease, and then it increases the susceptibility of drying and also fires. So once peatland forests are being logged, that's actually the start of like the problems that are going to happen to the peat ecosystem. And then when you continue with the draining of peatlands and then the planting of oil palm plantations, and then you lead to land subsidence, it's such a difficult ecosystem to restore. And it is really challenging. I think people who are working on peat restoration systems are finding ways to try to dam up the systems and also to try to reflood the peat. But it is a very, very challenging aspect of restoration. I think APP has a plan to restore 1 million hectares of peatlands, and I think that's a start in terms of a collaboration with peat experts and people who are working on the ground on these peat systems to try to restore these systems. With regards to local community participation, I think at the end of the day, it's also, in order to have a successful kind of project going on forward, and also for the long term, there is also a need to also clarify the kind of land rights which are on these systems. So if you have contestation of like communities or companies, and if these things are not resolved, at the end of the day, who's going to look after the long-term kind of like restoration of these systems? So this is also something that has to be taken into consideration, and that can only be solved, I guess, at the government level.
Thanks. So, yeah, you can respond. I'm going to go to the audience in a second, so it would be good to start lining up. We have a mic runner, so it'd be good to think about your questions. So I'm going to go to Lucy to respond to this, and also Simon. And so we've got about 10 minutes left, so just work.
Well, I guess I just want to pick up on a couple of points. One is basically the point about working with the communities. I think the one thing that made a difference in last year's worst possible El Nino episode, I think that we've experienced in this part of the world, was that the discourse has suddenly, or the approach has now included what is called prevention. Because I guess many of the companies, not just the rest of the public, have also started wondering, because we always get the flack anyway. We always, there's no incentive for us to burn. That is, we don't burn the basic resource that we need for the business, right? So, and it doesn't really make sense. But at the same time, we needed to understand the root cause. What is driving this? So telling the communities to burn is not enough. You need to, as you say, you need to actually also enable the communities. You cannot stop them from doing or pursuing their own agricultural activities. They have as much right or as much, who's to say that their economic need or their economic aspiration is not to be fulfilled. So the key is actually to give them the tools as well to do this, to give them the alternatives. So there's a program that we initiated called the Fire-Free Village Program. And basically what it does is that, one, it provides the villages with alternatives to land clearing, technical assistance, and at the same time it gives them incentives. If they don't burn over a particular dry season, they're actually given a reward for doing so. And the reward is something that they decide among themselves, because it also depends on their need. It could be a school, it could be a clinic, it could be a mosque, and basically also it comes with an educational aspect to it, because the long-term objective is basically behavior change. So this is just us being able to at least get them enlisted in the program with some sort of incentive, but it's also an entry point into engaging with the communities. Because many of them, having been born into years of burning as a means for clearing land, do not even associate it with health issues. But when we actually started installing air quality monitoring systems in some of the villages, and we explained to them, for example, what it means or how it links to the respiratory health of the children, we realized, in fact, that one of the key influences in the villages became the mothers. Then the mothers started telling the men in the community to say, do not do that, because our children are getting sick. And now, so it's long-term behavior change. So that's one. Now, I guess also on the point of eco-restoration, I understand. Peatland, indeed, is a very challenging ecosystem to restore. Now, our company is actually already in the process, or has a project called Peatland Riau Ecosystem Restoration Project. project, where we're actually restoring 150,000 hectares on peat. Now, we do not claim to know right now the actual solution, which is why we're working with several scientific institutions, conservation institutions I mentioned earlier. We're working with Fauna and Flora International. We have just asked the Nature Conservancy also to help us, because I guess one critical aspect of working with peatlands is understanding the entire landscape as a whole. We may be managing hydrologically, well, the plantations, but at the same time, or the concessions that we manage, but any neighboring oil palm plantation of a community that does not have proper water management skills can easily undermine whatever it is that we're doing with it, or however we're protecting the ecosystem. So that initiative is already ongoing.
Thanks, Lucy. Do you have a quick comment, Simon? Okay.
Very quick, I totally agree with you about traceability. Unless you've got traceability and transparency in your supply chain, you're never ever going to break the link between deforestation and palm oil. And that's what you need to push for. A couple of other things to talk about. We're also in a Free Fire Alliance. Sime Darby actually last year committed to going up to 5 kilometres beyond its boundaries. Now you might think 5 kilometres, yeah, hey, I walk that every day. You think of the concessions, you think of the size of land that it actually covers, and then you sit down and put that on Google Maps. 5 kilometres when you have a land bank of 1 million hectares is a phenomenal amount of land. I'd take a point about working that the governments are the only solution. I work with a lot of different governments, I work with a lot of different NGOs as well, and I think the solution is not in public-private partnerships, PPP. I think it's in public, private and people partnerships. Because a forest that pays is a forest that stays. And if we can make those forests valuable for the people, if we can make that as an alternative, and it's not just the value of the land, and it's not just what can be extracted from that forest, if we can make it viable, then that forest will stay. So people have to be involved. And part of that is really strong participatory mapping and community involvement through the FPIC process of what you're doing. So that was just the 2 bits. The last bit is, I really think that when you go into a development, to answer an earlier question, you really need to do something like a multidimensional poverty assessment tool, because we don't really have the evidence that palm oil is an economic improver yet. And I think that evidence is there, but it's not yet being gathered.
Thanks, Simon. So questions from the audience, and I think we'll take 3 questions to start. Sorry, just stand up and go to the mic. Yeah. And other folks who have questions, you should start going to the mic as well. Just get in line. Go ahead.
Good morning, all. My name is Joseph. I'm with the FFI. I have several questions. The first one is there any academic evidence on saying, for example, we have 10,000 hectares of palm oil or timber plantation and we protect around 100 hectares of it? Will it sustain, or we need to conserve more? That's just an example. So the question is, how big should a conservation area within a concession to make it sustain, and with scientific evidence, of course. And then the second one is for the private sectors. So how far would the private sectors go if, for example, again, the should be protected areas is included on the production line? For example, on a peat ecosystem, they are connected with, they're really hydrologically connected peatland. And on the edge of the peatland, it's been planted with palm oil or probably timber plantation, and it happens to be a land that needs to be protected to maintain the ecosystem. So how far the private sector would go? Would they shut down the production on that areas or what? And then the third one is for the community palm oil in Aceh or in Leuser. So it's the good things of having RSPO for big companies is they have liabilities if they cleared ACV areas. But it's not that straightforward for small scale or smallholders, palm oil plantation. So is there's any, from your experience, is there's any effective way on approaching the community on not to clear or to do a really good smallholder palm oil plantation management? I think that's it. Thank you, Rhett.
Thank you. So we'll take your question.
Hi, Tom Gray from Wildlife Alliance in Cambodia. So your plantations and concessions aren't necessarily bad habitat for charismatic megafauna like tigers and elephants. So how do you deal with human-wildlife conflict? And also do you, and I guess more importantly, your employees in your concessions, view having elephants and tigers in your concessions as a good thing or a bad thing?
Thank you. So those are the questions. Does anyone want to start? And we're pretty low on time, so I'd say keep the responses relatively short.
With regards to the academic evidence on biodiversity being sustained in the concession, I think biodiversity is a very broad term. You can think about fungus, you can think about tigers. There isn't really, I think, it really depends on the type of species that you're talking about. But there is a set kind of methodology that's being developed, or has been developed. It's called the high carbon stock approach. And it's quite a systematic way of trying to identify the types, and not just the area, but also the quality of your forests that are remaining or in the concession that has been given to you. And it's a very good approach. I can recommend you to read it up on online. And they basically use remote sensing information as well as look at the, what previous research has shown about, say, patch size or patch connectivity to try to identify what's the best approach in order to conserve your best forests and also the kind of area that you're talking about within the concession.
All right. Just on the question on, how big a conservation area should you have to match your, basically the approach that we did is we just did a 1-for-1. For every hectare that we planted, we're committed to conserve an equivalent hectare. And then of course we're now in the process, of course, of actually trying to understand whether the math actually adds up. And so, which means actually doing a full assessment of the high conservation value, the high carbon stock, and such. How far will private sector go? I think the willingness is there. The fact that we are willing to undertake a landscape assessment, for example, of our plantations and to review where is the optimal, or, how holistically can we actually map this out, and where is that optimal point where there's a balance across the different values, whether this be economic, conservation, social. That we are willing to look into that and to just see what actually would work as far as the entire landscape is concerned. Wildlife conflict. Okay, in the I mentioned earlier that of course one of the areas where we are very concerned about is protecting our conservation areas, and particularly the eco restoration system, where FFI is undertaking a biodiversity survey. And we are even very reticent about publishing some of the results of our biodiversity survey, because we know we don't want to announce what type of wildlife we are actually also finding in the ecosystem for fear of inviting encroachers or hunters into the area. There's an active system of patrol. We have recruited community members, in fact, to serve as forest rangers. Former illegal loggers, and some of them actually even former illegal loggers have been converted to become protectors of the forest, and which is also a good signal for the rest of the community as well, providing them not just economic alternatives, but a way to shift their mindset on how to appreciate the forest better. We do have, conservation is a big aspect of the policy of the company. This is something, of course, that we try to socialize as best as we can with our employees. It's a challenge because, of course, elephants are much less, I think, of a concern than tigers would be in the concessions, and it's not like I think the best way to do this is that basically we find ways to have connectivity and wildlife corridors so that we are able to make sure that the wildlife that cross the plantations are actually able to go through the conservation areas and the rest of the habitats.
Yeah. Right now, in all of the communities under stress because I say this is sick because they jealous with the companies, they jealous with the rich person. That's why, because the government allow the companies to encroach the forest, to change the forest to be palm oil, and after that the communities also follow this. But the communities encroach the forest by illegal, and the companies can process the permit to release forest to be unforest, and after that planting with the palm oil. And that's why very difficult to encourage the communities, but we have the opportunities because the flooding and natural disaster. And that's why when we start this program in 2006, this is the biggest flooding in Aceh. That's around $2 billion US dollar loss for the 7 days of the flood. And after that, we talk with the communities. You see the impact of the flooding. This is because of the deforestation in your forest. That's why you need to restore your forest. And after that, we start with so many formal meetings with the communities and to make them understand, and so that is more easier to follow. But some of the people, we cannot control for all of the communities because Leuser is very, very wide. And in the larger area, the other communities still encroach the forest, and this is difficult. And we only can work in the small area in one district, and right now we start to the other district, and until today we work for the 3 districts in Leuser. And the communities right now is quite understand, but some of them is still encroach the forest. And the problem also, the encroachment not from the local communities, but they come from the other city, like 90% of the illegal plantation in Aceh Tamiang district, they're not from Aceh, but from North Sumatra. The rich person, or also the small order, but they don't know about the forest, where the forest, what they encroach, and more and more. That's why, in this case, we work with the police and the forest department to arrest them or stop the clearing. And the second about the human wildlife conflict, I think that is very interesting because in last 20 years ago, there is no human-elephant conflict in our region, only for the small conflict. But after the communities and plantation come to Aceh and planting with the palm oil, after that, the elephant and the tiger make a conflict because palm oil is the favorite fruit for the elephant. And right now, we thought there is no, we cannot communities or plantation, and the elephant cannot live in one location, one area. That's why we need the demarcation between where the elephant and where the communities, where the plantation like that. But the plantation should be allocated the habitat for the wildlife, not only for the small area, but at least for larger area.
Thanks, Rudi. So we're over time, but Simon, this is dangerous, but I'll give you last word. I'm sorry, we don't have time for more questions.
I just have one question, please, Rhett. I'm standing up here. Just quickly for the private sector, you say that, don't you think that there's a disconnect between what you're trying to achieve in terms of sustainability, no deforestation, and the reality of your business of pursuing growth, we hear that, for example, the pulp paper industry is creating bigger mills, more outputs. So you'll have to have more wood fiber to feed these mills. And the oil palm industry itself is also pursuing expansion of more growth, more plantation. So how do you reconcile this, please? I'd like to know.
Yeah, so we're over time, so like just a few seconds. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Okay, take it very quickly. Tigers, elephants, good. Tigers, elephants in plantations, bad. The human-wildlife conflict exists. We haven't got a full handle on it. 3 things. In Kulim, in Johor, I work with the Kulim Wildlife Defenders, anti-poaching. We have arrested a number of gangs through Interpol by turning the night watchmen into anti-poachers. That's one example of that. The Pongo Alliance, where I work with the orangutans, where NGOs and the oil palm industry working on that one. Tigers Alive, which I also work with and just starting with. You want to see academic evidence? Jen Lucy of the University of York, and in fact Glenn Reynolds is sat here as well. They can give you some of the evidence as how big should a fragmented forest be in order to survive. Some of that thinking and work has gone into the high carbon stock approach. I urge you to read it as well. There's a patch analysis which talks about connection and connectivity. If any one of you can tell me what is the right size for a riparian buffer zone, I'd be really, really pleased to hear. In Malaysia it's 10 meters, in Papua New Guinea I use 50 meters, in Liberia I'm using 100 meters, because we have to define the function. Is it a buffer zone? Is it a riparian established zone, or is it a wildlife corridor? Go to your other bit, which is Eric Mayhart, I think, covered it yesterday. We have to stabilise the situation before you start getting companies to start repairing. Is there an appetite in many companies to actually go back and restore these lands? Not yet. You're sat in an auditorium. This auditorium was a primary forest. It then became a plantation of coconut, and now it's an institute of learning. And your last question, yes, we are pursuing growth. We have shareholders. My company in particular has 14 million individual small shareholders. They're the mums and pops. That's what a government-linked company in Malaysia does. They are also shareholders. By 2050, we're going to have 9 billion people. Agricultural production is going to have to rise by 70% to make it. In the companies I work for, I believe that what we should be doing is no more expansion. But what we should be doing is intensification. Now, that leads you into an issue. At the moment, intensification, I can increase yields by 3-fold using conventional breeding. But it takes time to get that seed through into all of nearly 660,000 hectares. I could do it quicker, but it will still take me 27 years if I put in place a genetic modified organism system. Is the world ever going to accept that? So we have a conflict.
We have to cut you off there. All right, 10 seconds or you? All right.
I think.
Literally 10 seconds.
Yeah, I guess it's just to respond to that point. There are many other strategies that companies are pursuing in terms of growth. Our company, for example, are looking into R&D to increase productivity, and at the same time into diversification into high-value products. So we're no longer expanding, for example, our pulp mill capacity. We are expanding paper mill capacity. So, and basically looking at high-value paper products so that we can still grow the business without necessarily expanding our pulp mill capacity at this point.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being a great audience, and I'm sure you can catch up with folks in the breaks. So thanks again.